Long ago, in an age of heroes, a mighty war raged that would be remembered for thousands of years to come. The clash between Greeks and Trojans has become legend, passing from generation to generation through whispered tales and epic poems. Was Troy real? The remains of an ancient city still stand on the western shores of Turkey. Its walls, once tall and proud, now crumbled by the hands of time and conquest. Within those walls, over 3,000 years ago, a story unfolded that would captivate the imagination of humanity forever. The tales of gods and warriors, of love and vengeance, reached us through the songs of ancient poets. Greatest among them was Homer, whose Iliad and Odyssey painted vivid pictures of golden-armored heroes and divine beings who shaped the fates of mortals with their whims and passions. Before these stories were ever written down, they lived on the lips of bards who sang them by firelight, entrancing listeners with adventures both wondrous and terrible. Picture a world where gods descended from Mount Olympus to walk among men, a world where honor meant more than life itself, where glory in battle was the highest pursuit, and where a single stolen bride could launch 1,000 ships across the wine-dark sea. This was the world of the Trojan War. The story pulses with every shade of human emotion, passionate love and bitter hatred, towering pride and crushing grief, blinding rage and tender mercy. For 10 long years, the greatest warriors of an age clashed beneath the walls of Troy. Wise Odysseus with his clever schemes, Achilles, whose wrath was as legendary as his prowess in battle, noble Hector, defender of his ancestral city, and Helen, whose beauty was said to rival the goddesses themselves. Their names have echoed down the corridors of time, remembered when countless kings and kingdoms have been forgotten. The reverberations of this war never truly faded. The stories born from it have been retold and reimagined countless times, inspiring everything from ancient Greek tragedies to modern films. They ask timeless questions about fate and free will, about the terrible price of honor, about what it truly means to be a hero. In many ways, the story of Troy marks the beginning of Western literature itself. Our tale does not begin with the thunderous clash of bronze weapons or the screams of dying men. Instead, it starts with a celebration, a divine wedding feast that would plant the seeds of conflict and tragedy. Join me now as we travel back to that fateful day when the mortal king Peleus wed the sea nymph Thetis, and the first threads of Troy's destiny began to unravel. The palace of King Peleus gleamed with golden light on his wedding day. The mortal king had won the heart of Thetis, a silver-footed sea nymph of extraordinary beauty. Not since the earliest days of creation had there been such a union between mortal and immortal. The gods themselves descended from their mountaintop palaces to attend the celebration, bearing gifts and blessings for the unlikely couple. Zeus, Lord of Thunder and King of the gods, reclined at the head table. Beside him sat his wife Hera, Queen of Heaven, resplendent in her finery. Poseidon, master of the seas, brought treasures from the ocean depths. Apollo strummed his golden lyre, filling the hall with music sweeter than mortal ears had ever heard. Dionysus ensured the wine flowed freely, while Athena watched the proceedings with her keen grey eyes. All the Olympians had come, all save one. Eris, goddess of discord and strife, had received no invitation. Perhaps Peleus feared her presence would cast a shadow over the joyous occasion, or perhaps it was a simple oversight. Whatever the reason, Eris learned of her exclusion, and her heart burned with bitter resentment. If she could not share in the celebration, she would ensure the revelers remembered her nonetheless. As the feast reached its height, with gods and mortals alike losing themselves in wine and merriment, A golden apple rolled across the banquet table. The fruit gleamed impossibly bright, catching every eye in the hall. Upon its lustrous skin, 3 words had been inscribed: "For the fairest." The celebration faltered as 3 goddesses rose from their seats, each convinced the apple was meant for her. Hera, the proud queen of the gods; Athena, the wise goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare; and Aphrodite, whose beauty was unmatched throughout creation. Each believed herself the rightful owner of the golden prize, and none would yield her claim. The dispute quickly grew heated. The 3 goddesses appealed to Zeus to judge between them, but the king of gods was too wise to make such a dangerous choice. Even Zeus, with all his power, dared not name one goddess fairer than the others, especially not when his own wife was among the contenders. Instead, he appointed a judge from among mortals, a young prince who watched his flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida, far from the splendor and intrigues of divine society. This shepherd prince was Paris, son of King Priam of Troy. Though raised among shepherds, Paris was actually born to royalty. Years earlier, his mother had dreamed that she would give birth to a flaming torch that would consume the city of Troy. The alarmed king had ordered the infant exposed on the mountainside, but fate had other plans. A kindly shepherd had found the child and raised him as his own. Now this forgotten prince, handsome and innocent of the world beyond his mountain pastures, would make a judgment that would shake the foundations of nations. Hermes, the fleet-footed messenger of the gods, led the 3 rival goddesses to the mountainside where Paris tended his sheep. The young man was startled by their radiant beauty, but the gods had given him the sight to behold their true forms, without being consumed by their glory. Each goddess, eager to win the golden apple, offered Paris a gift beyond mortal imagining if he would choose her. Hera spoke first, her voice regal and commanding. "Choose me as fairest," she said, "and I will make you a king among kings. You shall rule not just a city, but an empire that spans the known world. Power will be yours, and the respect of all men." Athena stepped forward next, her grey eyes gleaming with intelligence. "Choose me," she offered, "and I will make you the wisest of all warriors. Victory will follow you in battle, and your name will be remembered for your brilliant strategies and unmatched skill in combat." Last came Aphrodite, and when she spoke, her voice was like honey. "What use is power or glory?" she asked softly, "if your bed remains cold at night. Choose me, Paris, and I will give you the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta will be yours, and no man who looks upon her will not envy you." Paris, young and filled with the passions of youth, hardly hesitated. What were kingdoms or battlefields compared to the promise of love? He handed the golden apple to Aphrodite, naming her the fairest of the 3. In that moment, on a quiet mountainside far from the kingdoms of men, the first stone in an avalanche of war was set loose. Hera and Athena departed in anger, their wounded pride festering into hatred for Paris, and by extension, his home city of Troy. Aphrodite, delighted with her victory, reminded Paris of her promise. Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, would be his, despite the fact that she was already married to King Menelaus of Sparta. Not long after the judgment, Paris's true identity was discovered. He returned to Troy and was welcomed by his father, King Priam, who had long regretted abandoning his son. The Trojan court marveled at the handsome young prince who had appeared so suddenly among them. When Paris announced his intention to visit the kingdoms of Greece, supposedly on a diplomatic mission, his father gladly gave him ships and a suitable escort. But Paris had only one destination in mind: Sparta, where the legendary Helen lived as queen. While these events unfolded, the kingdoms of Greece had grown prosperous and powerful. The age of heroes was at its height, with many city-states ruled by men of legendary stature. Mycenae, the rich city of gold, was ruled by Agamemnon, a king whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. His brother Menelaus ruled Sparta, having won the hand of Helen, daughter of Zeus himself if the rumors were to be believed. Helen's beauty had drawn suitors from every corner of Greece. Before her marriage to Menelaus, her father, Tyndareus, had been concerned that choosing one husband for her would earn him the enmity of all the rejected suitors. The clever Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had suggested a solution. All suitors should swear an oath to support Helen's chosen husband and to defend her marriage against any who would break it. The kings and princes of Greece had sworn this oath, binding themselves to Helen's defense, an oath that would soon be called upon. In Sparta, King Menelaus received the Trojan prince with all courtesy, unaware of the designs Paris harbored for his wife. For several days, the Trojan delegation enjoyed Spartan hospitality. Paris charmed the court with tales of his homeland and exchanged gifts with Menelaus, all while his eyes returned again and again to Helen. Whether Helen fell in love with Paris, or was merely enchanted by Aphrodite's divine magic, or was taken against her will, the ancient sources disagree. What is certain is that when Menelaus was called away to attend funeral rites for his grandfather in Crete, Paris seized his opportunity. As the Spartan king sailed away, Paris and Helen boarded a Trojan ship under cover of darkness, taking with them a considerable portion of Menelaus's treasure. By the time Menelaus returned home to find his wife and wealth gone, the Trojan ships were already crossing the wine-dark sea toward the distant shores of Asia Minor. The king's rage shook the very foundations of his palace. The abduction, or elopement, was not merely a personal betrayal, but an insult to Greek honor. Helen had been claimed by a foreign prince, her marriage vows broken, and the sacred bonds of hospitality violated. Menelaus wasted no time. He sent messengers to his brother Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, and reminded all the former suitors of their oath. The time had come to make good on their promise, to defend the marriage of Helen and punish those who had broken it. The kings of Greece would go to war, and Troy would be their target. The gears of fate were now in motion, turning inexorably toward conflict. The casual spite of a goddess and the reckless desire of a prince had set the stage for a war that would consume a generation of heroes and reduce a mighty city to ashes and memory. The waves parted before the prow of Paris's ship as it cut through the Aegean waters toward Troy. On the deck, Helen stood wrapped in a sea-splashed cloak, her golden hair catching the sunlight. Behind her, the shores of Greece receded into the mist, the homeland she might never see again. Was her heart filled with passion for the handsome Trojan prince at her side, or with regret for the life she had abandoned? The ancient storytellers could never quite agree. Helen's life had never truly been her own. Daughter of Zeus and Leda, or so the legends claimed, her beauty was not merely exceptional, but divine, a gift and a curse that had shaped her destiny from birth. Even as a young girl, she had been abducted once before, taken by the hero Theseus before her suitors rescued her. Now, as a grown woman and queen of Sparta, she found herself once again carried across the sea, a living prize in the games of men and gods. Paris, meanwhile, gazed toward the horizon with triumph burning in his heart. He had won what Aphrodite promised. The most beautiful woman in the world was now his companion. The treasure from Menelaus's palace would be a worthy gift for his father, King Priam. But Helen herself was the true prize. In his youthful arrogance, Paris gave little thought to the consequences that might follow. The gods had favored him, and that seemed enough. After days at sea, the coastline of Asia Minor appeared on the horizon. The great city of Troy stood proud on its hill, its mighty walls catching the golden light of sunset. As Paris's ship approached the harbour, word of the prince's return and of his extraordinary companion raced ahead to the royal palace. King Priam and Queen Hecuba received their son in the great hall of Troy. Surrounded by their many children and advisors, Paris proclaimed Helen as his bride and displayed the treasure he had brought from Sparta. While some in the court murmured with concern about taking another king's wife, many were simply dazzled by Helen's beauty. It was said that when she entered a room, all fell silent, as if a goddess had descended among them. Not everyone welcomed the new arrival. Cassandra, Paris's sister, who had been blessed or cursed by Apollo with the gift of prophecy, cried out in horror when she saw Helen. "Fire!" she screamed. "I see fire consuming Troy's walls. Take her back before it's too late." But Cassandra's fate was cruel. Though she spoke only truth, no one would ever believe her prophecies. The court dismissed her warnings as madness, as they always did. Hector, Paris's eldest brother and Troy's greatest warrior, was more measured in his concern. "Brother," he said privately to Paris, "have you considered what you've done? You've taken another man's wife, not just any man, but a king of Greece. Do you think Menelaus will simply accept this loss? Do you think his powerful brother Agamemnon will let this insult stand?" Paris waved away these concerns. "The Greeks are divided among themselves," he replied. "Their kings quarrel as often as they feast together. And even if they do come, what of it? Has any army ever breached Troy's walls? Our city has stood for generations, protected by the gods themselves." In the days that followed, Paris and Helen were formally married according to Trojan custom. The people of Troy lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the legendary beauty as she processed to the temple. Some cheered the match as a triumph for Troy. Their prince had won a bride coveted by all Greece. Others, wiser perhaps, saw storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Meanwhile, in Sparta, Menelaus's rage had hardened into cold determination. The messengers he sent to his brother Agamemnon returned with promises of support. As High King among the Greeks, Agamemnon began the process of calling in old alliances and reminding the former suitors of their sacred oath. For Agamemnon, the abduction of Helen offered something he had long desired, a reason to unite the fractious kingdoms of Greece under his command, and perhaps to extend his power across the Aegean. Helen and Paris lived as husband and wife in Troy for nearly a year before the first Greek embassy arrived. Odysseus, the wily king of Ithaca, and Menelaus himself came to Troy, not with an army, but with words. They were received in King Priam's court with the courtesy due to royal visitors, despite the tension that hung in the air. "Return my wife and the treasure that was stolen," Menelaus demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Do this, and there need be no blood spilled between our peoples." Odysseus, ever the diplomat, added, "King Priam, surely you understand that this matter goes beyond a dispute between two men. The sacred laws of hospitality have been violated. Your son was welcomed as a guest in Menelaus's home, and he repaid that welcome by stealing the host's wife and possessions. All Greece watches to see how this breach will be addressed." King Priam, torn between his love for his recently restored son and his sense of justice, looked to Paris. The young prince sat with Helen at his side, his hand possessively covering hers. "She came willingly," Paris declared. and I will not give her up. Some accounts say that Helen was present at this meeting, but remained silent, her eyes downcast, her thoughts her own. Others claim she was kept away, either by Paris's jealousy or by her own shame at facing her former husband. Whatever the truth, the embassy ended in failure. Odysseus and Menelaus returned to their waiting ships with nothing but Troy's refusal. As the Greek kings sailed back across the Aegean, Troy began to prepare for war. Hector took command of strengthening the city's already formidable defenses. Allies were called from neighboring kingdoms in Asia Minor. Stores of food were gathered, for if war came, it might be a long one. Paris, for his part, seemed to take the threat less seriously. He spent his days with Helen in the comforts of the palace, confident in Troy's walls and in divine favor. After all, had not Aphrodite herself sanctioned their union? It was said that at night, from their chamber, high in one of Troy's towers, they could see the fires of the watchmen burning along the coast, fires that would soon be joined by 1,000 Greek campfires, as an army the like of which the world had never seen gathered on Trojan shores. In Greece, the call to arms spread from kingdom to kingdom. The oath that bound Helen's former suitors was invoked, and ships began to gather at Aulis, where the combined Greek force, the Achaeans, as Homer would call them, would launch their great fleet. Some kings came eagerly, seeing opportunity for glory and plunder. Others came reluctantly, bound by oath, but doubtful of the cause. And so the stage was set. Because of a goddess's spite, a prince's desire, and a woman's fateful journey across the sea, two worlds stood on the brink of a conflict that would consume them both. Troy, proud and ancient, secure behind its legendary walls, and the kingdoms of Greece, united for perhaps the first time in their history, preparing to cross the wine-dark sea with vengeance in their hearts. The harbour at Aulis filled with ships from every corner of Greece. Their sails, furled tight against tall masts, created a forest of timber where once there had been only open water. On the shore, thousands of men made camp, kings and princes, nobles and common soldiers, all gathered under the banner of vengeance. The greatest military force the ancient world had ever seen was assembling, and at its head stood Agamemnon, king of rich Mycenae, brother to the wronged Menelaus. Agamemnon's tent dominated the shoreline, marked by his royal standard. Inside, the High King met with the other leaders of the expedition, tracing their plans on maps spread across tables of polished wood. His face was grim but satisfied. For years he had dreamed of extending his power across the Aegean, of bringing the wealthy trading cities of Asia Minor under Greek influence. Now Paris had handed him the perfect justification. This war would begin for Helen, but Agamemnon's ambitions stretched far beyond the recovery of his brother's wife. Not all of the Greek kings had come willingly to Aulis. Some had tried to evade the call, reluctant to leave their kingdoms for what might be years of fighting on distant shores. Odysseus, the clever ruler of rocky Ithaca, had feigned madness when Agamemnon's messengers arrived. He had yoked an ox and a horse together to plough his fields and sown them with salt instead of seed. But Palamedes, one of Agamemnon's craftier allies, had placed Odysseus's infant son Telemachus in the path of the plough. Odysseus had swerved to avoid his child, proving his sanity and revealing his deception. Bound by his oath, he had no choice but to join the expedition, though his heart remained in Ithaca with his wife Penelope and their son. The greatest challenge was finding Achilles, the young warrior whom prophecy named as essential to Greek victory. Son of King Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. Yes, the very couple whose wedding had set these events in motion. Achilles was said to be nearly invincible, the greatest fighter of his generation. But his mother, knowing that war meant death for her beloved son, had hidden him on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. Odysseus, now committed to the cause, devised a plan to reveal Achilles. Disguised as a traveling merchant, he brought gifts for the king's daughters, fine fabrics, jewels, and other feminine treasures. But among these gifts, he included a magnificent sword and shield. While the girls admired the pretty trinkets, one reached instinctively for the weapons, revealing a warrior's instinct that no disguise could hide. Achilles' identity uncovered, he too joined the gathering forces at Aulis, bringing with him his loyal friend Patroclus and a contingent of elite warriors, the Myrmidons. With each passing day, more ships arrived at Aulis. From Athens came 50 vessels under the command of King Menestheus. Diomedes led 80 ships from Argos. Ajax the Greater, a warrior second only to Achilles in might, brought 12 ships from Salamis. His namesake, Ajax the Lesser, arrived with 40 ships from Locris. Nestor, the oldest of the kings, whose wisdom was respected by all, sailed from sandy Pylos with 90 ships. In all, nearly 1,200 ships gathered in the bay, carrying some 100,000 men. Among this vast host, certain figures stood out. There was Philoctetes, who possessed the mighty bow of Heracles. Idomeneus led the Cretan forces, his helmet adorned with boar's tusks in the ancient style. The healer Machaon and his brother Podalirius, sons of Asclepius, would tend to the wounded. And watching it all with keen eyes was Calchas, the seer whose prophecies would guide the expedition. Yet despite this unprecedented gathering of power, the fleet remained in harbour, unable to sail. For weeks, the winds refused to blow. The waters of the bay lay flat as polished bronze, and the great ships sat motionless at anchor. As days stretched into weeks, discontent spread through the encampment. Some whispered that the gods themselves opposed the expedition. Others suggested returning home before winter made sailing even more dangerous. Desperate for a solution, Agamemnon turned to Calchas, the expedition's prophet. The seer's face was grave as he delivered his message. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, holds back the winds. She demands a sacrifice for an offense against her sacred deer, killed in her grove by the king's own hand. The goddess will accept nothing less than the life of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's eldest daughter. The High King's face turned ashen at these words. Iphigenia, his beautiful child, sacrificed like a common animal upon an altar. He raged against the prophecy, called Calchas a false prophet, threatened to abandon the entire expedition. But as the days passed with no change in the winds, and as the other kings began to speak of returning to their homes, Agamemnon's resolve weakened. Finally, he sent word to his wife Clytemnestra in Mycenae, telling her to bring Iphigenia to Aulis, not for sacrifice, but under the pretense that she was to be married to Achilles. It was a cruel deception, one that would later bear terrible fruit, but Agamemnon convinced himself it was necessary for the greater purpose of uniting Greece. Mother and daughter arrived at Aulis, adorned for a wedding. Iphigenia, eager to see her father and excited by the prospect of marriage to the legendary Achilles, rushed from the chariot into Agamemnon's arms. The king embraced his daughter with tears in his eyes, knowing what awaited her. The accounts of what happened next differ. Some say that Iphigenia discovered the truth and, displaying courage worthy of her royal blood, willingly offered herself for sacrifice to ensure Greek victory. Others tell that she was taken by force to the altar, crying and pleading for her life while her father looked away in shame. A third tradition holds that at the final moment, Artemis herself intervened, replacing Iphigenia with a deer and spiriting the girl away to serve as a priestess in a distant land. Whatever the truth, after the ceremony was completed, the winds began to blow. The sails of 1,200 ships filled at last, straining against their ropes. The prophet Calchas declared the goddess appeased, and Agamemnon gave the order to depart. As the sun rose the following morning, the greatest armada the world had ever seen moved out of the bay at Aulis. Ship after ship passed between the headlands, their painted prows cutting through the waves, their decks crowded with armed men gazing toward the horizon. They left behind them a grieving mother, Clytemnestra, whose heart now burned with hatred for her husband, a hatred that would one day claim Agamemnon's life. But that reckoning lay far in the future. For now, the Greek fleet sailed east, with the favorable wind at their backs. The oarsmen established a steady rhythm, and the ships moved in formation across the Aegean Sea. Each night they would put in at an island to rest and take on fresh water, and each morning they would set out again, drawing ever closer to the shores of Troy. As they sailed, the bards among them sang of glorious deeds to come. Young warriors imagined themselves winning fame in battle beneath Troy's walls. The kings plotted strategies and alliances. None could know that this journey, which they expected to end in swift victory, was the beginning of a 10-year ordeal that would claim the lives of countless heroes and become the defining epic of their age. On the walls of Troy, watchmen kept their vigil day and night, scanning the eastern horizon for the first glimpse of enemy sails. Inside the city, Hector drilled the Trojan forces and their allies, preparing for the storm that was about to break upon them. Paris spent his time with Helen in the luxury of the palace, perhaps beginning to understand the gravity of what he had set in motion. And Helen herself, what thoughts passed through her mind as she awaited the arrival of her former countrymen and her abandoned husband. The ancient poems are silent on this, leaving us to wonder whether she felt triumph, regret, or some complex emotion beyond simple description. The winds that had been held back for so long now blew steadily, carrying the Greek fleet ever closer to its destination. The gods watched from Mount Olympus, some favoring the Greeks, others the Trojans, all anticipating the clash of heroes that would soon echo across the plains of Ilium. The journey that had begun with a golden apple at a wedding feast was about to enter its most bloody phase. The vast Greek fleet carved its path across the Aegean, a moving city of timber and canvas stretched across the blue waters. White foam churned beneath 1,000 hulls as oarsmen pulled in rhythm to the steady beat of drummers. On the lead ship, Agamemnon stood at the prow, his crimson cloak snapping in the wind, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where Troy awaited. The journey was not direct. The Greeks, many of whom had never sailed beyond sight of their homeland's shores, followed a winding route from island to island. Each night they beached their vessels on sheltered shores, made camp, hunted for fresh meat, and refilled their water skins. The kings gathered around fires to discuss strategy, while the common soldiers told tales of home, or speculated about the glories and riches that awaited them in Asia. Not all the islands welcomed them as liberators or allies. Some, fearing Trojan reprisals should the expedition fail, refused to provide supplies. Others, with ties of trade or kinship to Troy, actively resisted. The first blood of the war was shed not beneath Troy's walls, but on these scattered islands, as the Greeks took by force what was not freely given. Achilles distinguished himself in these early conflicts. On the island of Tenedos, when local forces ambushed the Greeks as they came ashore seeking water, the young warrior led a counterattack that routed the defenders and captured their main settlement. It was here that he won, as his prize, the maiden Briseis, a fateful acquisition that would later trigger his withdrawal from the war. the fleet paused at the sacred island of Lemnos, where Philoctetes, bearer of the mighty bow of Heracles, suffered a terrible misfortune. A venomous serpent, guardian of a shrine, bit his foot. The wound festered, producing a stench so foul that the other Greeks could not bear his presence. Following Odysseus's counsel, Agamemnon ordered Philoctetes abandoned on Lemnos, leaving the suffering archer to fend for himself on the desolate island. This cruel decision, expedient though it seemed, would later force the Greeks to humbly seek the man they had discarded. As the fleet neared Trojan waters, Menelaus grew increasingly restless. 10 years had passed since he had last seen Helen, 10 years in which his love had curdled into something darker, a need for vengeance that consumed his thoughts. "Will she remember me?" he asked his brother one night as they shared wine beneath the stars. "Will she still be beautiful? Or has time dimmed what the poets called her god-touched radiance?" Agamemnon had no answers for these questions. His own thoughts dwelled not on Helen, but on Troy's rumored wealth and the glory that would come from conquering a city thought unconquerable. And perhaps, in quiet moments, his mind returned to Aulis and the daughter he had sacrificed to reach this point, a memory he pushed away each time it surfaced. Before the fleet could reach Troy itself, an important question needed resolution: where precisely to land? Troy's immediate coastline offered few suitable beaches for landing such a massive force. Moreover, the Trojans would certainly be watching these approaches most carefully. Nestor, the oldest and wisest of the kings, advised caution. "We should not announce ourselves with the full strength of our fleet. Let us send a smaller force first, to secure a landing place and assess the Trojan defenses." Odysseus agreed with this plan, but added his own counsel. "Before we commit to battle, we should at least attempt to resolve this matter through diplomacy. Perhaps, seeing our strength, Priam will return Helen and make reparations without the need for bloodshed." And so it was decided. A small advance fleet would proceed to the Trojan coast, while the main force would temporarily hold position among the scattered islands offshore, hidden from Trojan scouts. Odysseus, known for his persuasive speech, would lead an embassy to Troy once a beachhead was established. The advance ships, led by Protesilaus of Phyllis, approached the Trojan shore at dawn. From hiding places among the coastal rocks, Trojan archers watched the Greek vessels draw near. As the first ship grounded on the beach and lowered its gangplank, a hail of arrows greeted the invaders. Protesilaus, eager for the glory of being first ashore on Trojan soil, leapt from his ship with shield raised. An arrow found the gap between his shield and breastplate, piercing his lung. He staggered forward 3 steps onto Trojan land before falling. In that moment, he fulfilled an old prophecy, that the first Greek to touch Trojan soil would be the first to die. Despite this inauspicious beginning, the advance force pushed forward, driving back the Trojan defenders and securing a large enough section of beach for the main fleet to land. Word was sent to Agamemnon, and soon the full Greek armada approached the shore, an awesome sight that caused even the bravest Trojan scouts to retreat toward the safety of their city's walls. As thousands of Greek soldiers established their camp on the Trojan plain, Odysseus prepared for his diplomatic mission. With Menelaus at his side and a small honor guard, he approached Troy's mighty gates, carrying olive branches as symbols of peaceful intent. The Trojans, impressed by this gesture and curious about the kings who had sailed so far to their shores, opened their gates and escorted the Greek embassy to Priam's palace. In the great hall of Troy, before the assembled court, Odysseus spoke with all the eloquence for which he was famous. King Priam, noble princes of Troy, we come before you not seeking war, though as you have seen, we are prepared for it. We come seeking justice for a grave wrong. Your son Paris has taken what is not his, the wife of King Menelaus and the treasure of Sparta. Return Helen and these stolen goods. Make fair reparation for this breach of sacred hospitality, and we will depart in peace, leaving Troy unharmed. Menelaus then stepped forward, his eyes scanning the hall for Helen, but finding only curious Trojan faces. I speak not as a king now, but as a husband. Return my wife to me. Whatever passed between her and Paris, I am willing to forgive if she returns willingly. Troy need not suffer for the actions of one man. Priam, dignified in his advanced age, rose from his throne. You speak of justice and peace, yet you bring an army to our shores. Your ships blacken our coast from end to end. Are these the actions of men seeking peaceful resolution? Before Odysseus could reply, Paris entered the hall with Helen at his side. Her face was veiled, but all eyes turned to her nonetheless. Paris spoke with the confidence of youth, seemingly untroubled by the gravity of the situation. Helen is my wife now, by her own choice, and by the blessing of Aphrodite herself. What kind of husband would I be if I surrendered her to another man? What kind of Trojan would surrender what he loves because of Greek threats? Menelaus started forward, hand moving instinctively to his sword, but Odysseus restrained him. This was neither the time nor place for violence. The Greek embassy departed without achieving its goal, but not before Antenor, one of Priam's oldest advisors, pulled Odysseus aside. Not all in Troy support this folly. Some of us urged returning the woman before your ships even appeared on our horizon. But Paris has the king's ear, and Priam's love for his son blinds him to the danger. With the failure of diplomacy, both sides prepared for war. The Greeks expanded their beachhead, building a fortified camp that stretched along the shore, with their ships drawn up on the beach behind palisade walls. The Trojans gathered their forces within their city and sent messengers to their allies throughout Asia Minor, calling for aid against the Greek invaders. From the walls of Troy, Helen watched the Greek camp taking shape on the distant shore. Did she search the milling figures for a glimpse of her former husband? Did she regret the choices, or lack of choices, that had brought two nations to the brink of war? The ancient tales are silent on her thoughts, leaving only the image of a woman watching from the walls as armies gathered to fight in her name. The stage was now set for a conflict that would last far longer than either side anticipated. The Greeks had reached Troy, their mighty force assembled on foreign soil. The Trojans stood firm behind their legendary walls, confident in their defenses and their divine protectors. Soon the plain between city and sea would echo with the clash of bronze, the war cries of heroes, and the names of men seeking glory in the face of death. Dawn broke over the plain of Troy, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The bronze tips of Greek spears caught the early light as the army formed its battle lines. Across the field, the gates of Troy swung open and Trojan forces marched out to meet their foes. The first major battle of the war was about to begin. For 9 long years, this scene would repeat itself with variations, an endless cycle of advances and retreats, small victories and defeats, moments of heroism and tragedy that blended together in the grinding machinery of war. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The Greeks, for all their numbers, could not breach Troy's mighty walls. The Trojans, despite occasional successes in the field, could not drive the invaders back into the sea. In those early years, the war spread beyond the plain of Troy itself. Realizing that a direct assault on the city might prove impossible, Achilles led raids against Troy's allies and supply lines. With his myrmidons, elite warriors who followed him with unwavering loyalty, he attacked 12 cities by sea and 11 by land, according to Homer's count. Each fell before his fury, adding to his legend and filling the Greek camp with plunder and slaves. Among the cities sacked was Lyrnessus, where Achilles captured Briseis, a noblewoman whom he took as his prize. Though she came to him as a captive, something grew between them that transcended their circumstances. Not love, perhaps, but a mutual respect that made her more than simply a spoil of war in his eyes. Meanwhile, Odysseus and Diomedes led scouting missions and ambushes, using cunning where strength alone might fail. During one such mission, they captured Dolon, a Trojan spy, who revealed valuable information about Troy's defenses and allies before meeting his end at Greek hands. The Trojans were not passive in these exchanges. Hector, Troy's greatest warrior and Paris's elder brother, led bold sorties against the Greek camp. With his distinctive helmet with its horsehair plume, he was a rallying point for Trojan forces and a figure of dread for Greek soldiers. Unlike Paris, whose interests lay more in the pleasures of the palace than the hardships of battle, Hector embodied the ideal of Trojan nobility, a devoted husband to Andromache, a loving father to his son Astyanax, and a tireless defender of his city. The gods themselves took sides in this mortal conflict. Apollo, the archer god, favored Troy, as did Aphrodite, who had started the war through her promise to Paris, and Ares, who delighted in the bloodshed. The Greeks found supporters in Hera and Athena, still bitter over Paris's judgment, and in Poseidon, who held an ancient grudge against Troy for a slight by a previous king. Zeus, father of gods and men, attempted to remain neutral, though his sympathies often seemed to lean toward the Trojans. Divine intervention manifested in various ways. Sometimes a god would deflect an arrow meant for a favored hero or strengthen a warrior's arm at a crucial moment. At other times, the immortals took a more active role, appearing on the battlefield in disguise to turn the tide of battle. When Aphrodite saw Paris losing a duel to Menelaus, she wrapped her protégé in a mist and spirited him away to safety, an inglorious rescue that did little for the prince's reputation among his own people. Life in the Greek camp settled into routines over the years. The kings still met in Agamemnon's tent to discuss strategy, though increasingly these councils dissolved into arguments as frustration grew. The common soldiers built more permanent structures for themselves, accepting that this would be no quick campaign. They fished, hunted in the nearby hills, and held competitions to maintain their fighting edge during lulls in the fighting. Inside Troy, conditions gradually deteriorated as the siege continued. While the city's massive grain stores prevented starvation, fresh meat and produce became increasing luxuries. The constant state of alert wore on civilians and soldiers alike. Children who had been infants when the war began were now old enough to train with wooden swords, preparing to take their places on the walls if the conflict continued much longer. Helen's position in Troy grew more complex as the years passed. Some Trojans blamed her for their suffering, whispering curses as she passed. Others, including the elderly King Priam, treated her with kindness, seeing her as a victim of fate and divine manipulation rather than the cause of their troubles. She spent hours on the walls, watching the distant battles, sometimes called upon to identify Greek heroes for the Trojan observers who had never seen these men in peacetime. In the 8th year of the war, a potential turning point arrived with the appearance of Rhesus, king of Thrace, who came to Troy's aid with fresh troops and magnificent white horses. A prophecy stated that if these horses drank from the river Xanthus and grazed on Trojan grass, the city would never fall. Learning of this through spies, Odysseus and Diomedes undertook a night mission into the Trojan camp. Under cover of darkness, they slaughtered the sleeping Rhesus and many of his men, then stole the prophetic horses before they could fulfill the conditions that would have made Troy impregnable. This pattern of raid and counter-raid, of battle followed by uneasy truce, might have continued indefinitely, had not a fateful quarrel erupted in the Greek camp, a dispute between kings that would change the course of the war and lead to the deaths of its greatest heroes. During a successful raid on a town allied with Troy, the Greeks captured two noble women. Chryseis, daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo, and Briseis, who was given to Achilles after the sack of Lyrnessus. Agamemnon claimed Chryseis as his prize, but soon after, a plague struck the Greek camp. Calchas the seer revealed the cause. Apollo was punishing them for Agamemnon's enslavement of the priest's daughter. Reluctantly, Agamemnon agreed to return Chryseis to her father, ending the plague. But the High King's pride demanded compensation. "If I must lose my prize," he declared before the assembled Greek leaders, "then I shall take one of yours in her place." His eyes fell on Achilles, whose fame and independence had long rankled him. "I will take Briseis, your captive, to replace the woman I have lost." Achilles' hand flew to his sword. "You coward!" he spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You lead from the rear, while better men bleed for your cause, and now you would steal what I have earned with my own hands." Only the intervention of Athena, visible to Achilles alone, prevented him from striking down the High King, then and there. Instead, the greatest warrior of the Greeks made a fateful decision. "Take her," he said at last, his voice cold as winter. "But know this, my men and I will fight no more in your war. Let us see how you fare against Hector without Achilles at your side." True to his word, Achilles withdrew to his tent and his ships, taking his myrmidons with him. For days he sat brooding by the shore, watching as the tide of battle turned against the Greeks without his strength to tip the scales. The Trojans, sensing the Greeks' disarray, pressed their advantage. Hector led increasingly bold attacks, driving the invaders back to their ships. Without Achilles, the Greeks found themselves fighting for survival rather than victory. The war had entered a new and deadlier phase, one that would bring both sides to the edge of destruction. As flames began to lick at the first Greek ships, pushed burning toward the fleet by Trojan forces, the consequences of the quarrel between kings became clear. Pride and honor, the twin currencies of heroic society, had set heroes against each other just as surely as they had launched the war itself. Now, as the Greeks faltered without their greatest champion, desperate measures would be needed to reverse their failing fortunes. The stage was set for the central tragedy of the Trojan War, a chain of events that would begin with a friend's well-intentioned intervention and end with the deaths of the mightiest warriors on both sides. The wrath of Achilles, kindled by Agamemnon's insult, would soon consume the battlefield in fire, more devastating than any the Trojans could bring to the Greek ships. Smoke darkened the sky above the Greek camp as more ships caught fire. Trojan warriors swarmed forward, emboldened by Hector's leadership and the conspicuous absence of Achilles from the battlefield. The Greeks fought with desperate courage, but they were being pushed inexorably back toward the sea that had carried them to these hostile shores. In his black-hulled ship at the edge of the camp, Achilles watched the battle unfold with stony indifference. His armor hung untouched on its stand. His legendary spear, which few other men could even lift, leaned unused against the wall. The great hero's wrath burned cold within him. a rage directed not at the Trojans, but at Agamemnon, who had publicly dishonored him by taking Briseis. "The Greeks are being slaughtered," said Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion since childhood. "Our friends are dying while you sit brooding over an insult." Achilles' eyes remained fixed on the distant battle. "An insult? Is that what you call it when a man takes what is yours by right of conquest? When he undermines you before all the army? No, my friend. This is not about a woman. This is about honor, without which a man is nothing." As the situation grew dire, Agamemnon finally acknowledged his error. He sent an embassy to Achilles' tent, Odysseus, Ajax, and the old mentor Phoenix, bearing gifts and promises of reconciliation. Agamemnon offered to return Briseis untouched, along with 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 bronze cauldrons, 12 horses, 7 women skilled in crafts, and 20 Trojan captives of Achilles' choosing, should Troy fall. He even offered one of his own daughters in marriage, and 7 prosperous towns as a dowry. Odysseus presented these offers with all his famous eloquence, appealing to Achilles' sense of compassion for his suffering comrades. Ajax, more blunt, reminded him of the bonds of friendship that united the Greek leaders. Old Phoenix, who had helped raise Achilles, told him a parable about the dangers of unyielding anger. But Achilles remained unmoved. "I will not fight for Agamemnon," he declared. "The man has no honor, and I want nothing from him. Not his gold, not his women, not his friendship. Let him reap what he has sown." The embassy returned empty-handed, leaving the Greek leaders to prepare for what seemed inevitable defeat. Yet Achilles was not entirely without compassion. As Hector's forces pressed closer to the heart of the Greek camp, he allowed his beloved friend Patroclus to borrow his distinctive armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle. "Wear my armor," Achilles told him. "The Trojans will think I have returned to the fight and may lose heart. But listen carefully. Push them back from our ships, but go no further. Do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. The gods favor Hector within sight of his city." Patroclus agreed, though his heart was already racing with the prospect of glory. He donned the magnificent armor of Achilles, the gleaming breastplate, the greaves with their silver ankle clasps, the ornate shield, and most distinctive of all, the helmet with its horsehair crest that could be seen across the battlefield. The effect of his appearance was exactly as Achilles had predicted. Seeing what they thought was the dreaded Achilles returning to battle, many Trojan warriors broke ranks and fled. Patroclus led the Myrmidons in a ferocious counterattack, pushing the Trojans back from the burning ships. But in the heat of combat, flushed with success and the unfamiliar sensation of being feared as Achilles was feared, Patroclus forgot his promise. Instead of withdrawing once the immediate danger to the ships had passed, he pressed forward, pursuing the retreating Trojans across the plain toward their city. 3 times Patroclus charged the walls of Troy, and 3 times Apollo himself pushed him back. "Return, Patroclus," the god warned. "This is not your destiny." But caught up in battle frenzy, Patroclus ignored the divine warning. As he fought near the walls, the god struck Patroclus from behind, stunning him and knocking his helmet from his head. In that vulnerable moment, a Trojan warrior named Euphorbus speared him in the back. Wounded and disoriented, Patroclus stumbled backward, directly into the path of Hector. Troy's greatest champion did not hesitate. His spear drove deep into Patroclus's unprotected belly. As the Greek warrior collapsed, Hector stood over him with grim triumph. "Did you think you were Achilles?" he asked. "Did you think you could sack our city wearing his armor? Now you fall, and he will not come to save you." With his dying breath, Patroclus managed a prophecy of his own. "Enjoy your victory while you can, Hector. Death already stands behind you, waiting. Achilles will not rest until you lie as I do now." A brutal fight erupted over Patroclus's body and the armor of Achilles that he wore. The Myrmidons fought desperately to recover their fallen comrade, while the Trojans, led by Hector, sought to claim the legendary armor as a trophy. In the end, Menelaus and Ajax managed to carry Patroclus's broken body back to the Greek camp, but Hector retreated to Troy with Achilles' armor as his prize. When word reached Achilles that Patroclus had fallen, his grief knew no bounds. He threw himself to the ground, pouring dust over his head and tearing at his hair. His anguished cries carried across the camp, chilling the blood of all who heard them. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, rose from the waves in response to her son's pain. She found him beyond consolation, consumed now by a new kind of wrath, not the cold anger he had nursed against Agamemnon, but a white-hot fury directed at Hector and all of Troy. "I will return to battle," Achilles vowed. "I will not eat or drink until Patroclus is avenged and Hector lies dead by my hand." "My son," Thetis said, her voice breaking with foreknowledge of what was to come. "If you kill Hector, your own death will follow swiftly. This is the fate the fates have spun for you." "Then let it come," Achilles replied without hesitation. "What worth has life when I have failed to protect the one I loved most? I will not live with this shame." Since Hector now possessed Achilles' armor, Thetis journeyed to Olympus itself, to the forge of Hephaestus, the divine craftsman. She begged him to create new armor for her son, and moved by her plea, the lame god worked through the night at his magical forge. By dawn, he had created the most magnificent armor ever worn by a mortal. A shield depicting the entire cosmos, a breastplate that shone like the sun, greaves of indestructible bronze, and a helmet crowned with a plume of pure gold. When Thetis delivered this divine panoply to her son, Achilles wasted no time. He called for an assembly of the entire Greek army. Before the gathered host, he formally renounced his quarrel with Agamemnon. "The anger that divided us has cost too much," he declared. "While we squabbled like children, good men died. I return to battle now, not for you, Agamemnon, but for Patroclus, who deserved better than to die wearing my armor while I sulked in my tent." Agamemnon, equally eager to put their feud behind them in the face of a common enemy, accepted Achilles' return without demanding apology. He immediately ordered Briseis returned, along with all the gifts he had promised, but Achilles waved this aside. "Keep your treasures. They mean nothing to me now. All that matters is getting to Hector before the sun sets." As Achilles prepared for battle, strapping on his new divine armor, his immortal horses, Xanthus and Balius, offspring of the west wind, spoke to him with human voice, a rare and ominous sign. "We will carry you swiftly today, mighty Achilles," said Xanthus. "But the hour of your death approaches. It is not through any failure of ours that Patroclus fell, but by the will of the gods and the strength of men. I know I am doomed to die here, far from my homeland," Achilles replied grimly, "but I will not depart for the house of Hades before sending many Trojans ahead to announce my coming." When Achilles finally charged onto the battlefield in his gleaming new armor, the effect was terror-inducing. Trojans who had been confidently pursuing the Greeks now turned and ran in panic. Many were cut down as they fled. Others, in their desperation to escape, plunged into the river Scamander, where Achilles followed, slaughtering them in such numbers that the river god himself rose up in protest, nearly drowning the hero in his swirling waters. Only the intervention of Hephaestus, who sent fire to dry up the river's fury, saved Achilles from this divine wrath. Freed from the river's clutches, he continued his rampage across the plain, driving the surviving Trojans back to their city like frightened cattle. At the gates of Troy, only one man remained outside, as the massive doors swung shut behind the retreating army. Hector, Troy's champion, waited alone to face the approaching storm. His father, King Priam, and his mother, Hecuba, pleaded with him from the walls to come inside, to fight another day. But Hector stood his ground. "I cannot hide behind walls while others die for me," he said. "I led our forces in their confidence. I cannot abandon them in their fear." As Achilles drew nearer, however, even Hector's courage faltered. The man approaching him seemed more than human, his divine armor blazing in the sun, his face a mask of unstoppable fury. At the last moment, Hector's nerve broke, and he ran, not in the shame of cowardice, but in the instinctive recognition that he faced something beyond mortal opposition. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy, Achilles in pursuit, Hector in flight. The gods watched from above, Apollo, who had protected Hector many times before, and Athena, who ensured Achilles would not fail in his pursuit. It was Athena who finally ended the chase by appearing to Hector in the guise of his brother, suggesting they make a stand together. When Hector turned to find his brother was not there, Achilles was upon him. The duel between the 2 greatest warriors of their age was brief, but terrible. Hector fought with the desperate courage of a man defending everything he loved, but Achilles fought with the transcendent fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. The outcome was never truly in doubt. Achilles' spear found the gap at Hector's throat, one of the few vulnerable spots in the armor that had once belonged to Achilles himself. As Hector lay dying, he made a final request. "I beg you, by your own life and by your parents, do not leave my body to be devoured by dogs and birds. Accept the ransom my father will offer, and let him give me proper burial rites." But Achilles, still consumed by grief and rage, was beyond such human considerations. "Beg me not by my parents," he snarled. "I wish my fury would drive me to cut your flesh and eat it raw for what you've done. No ransom will convince me to return your body. The dogs and birds will have you, as you would have done with Patroclus had you taken him." With his last breath, Hector prophesied, "Remember, on the day Paris and Apollo bring you down before the Scaean gates, remember my words." After Hector's death, Achilles' treatment of his enemy's body shocked even his fellow Greeks. He pierced the fallen hero's heels, threaded them with leather thongs, and dragged the corpse behind his chariot, circling the city walls in a grim parody of their earlier chase. For 11 days he continued this desecration, driving around the tomb of Patroclus each morning with Hector's body in tow. The gods themselves were outraged by this violation of sacred custom. Zeus sent Thetis to her son with a message. "You have angered the immortals with your excessive vengeance. The time has come to accept ransom and return Hector's body to his people." On the 12th night, guided by Hermes, King Priam of Troy made his way secretly into the Greek camp and to Achilles' tent. The old king knelt before the man who had killed so many of his sons, most notably his beloved Hector, and kissed the hands that had brought him such grief. "Remember your own father, Achilles," Priam said, his voice steady despite his sorrow. "He is old, as I am old, and he waits for a son who may never return. At least he can hope while I kneel before the killer of my children." Have pity, if not for me, then for the memory of your own father." These words penetrated Achilles' armor of grief and rage. For the first time since Patroclus' death, he wept, not just for his friend, but for all that had been lost, for his own approaching death, for the futility of the endless cycle of violence and vengeance. Together, the old king and the young warrior grieved for their respective losses, finding a moment of shared humanity amid the waste of war. When dawn came, Achilles had Hector's body washed, anointed with oils, and wrapped in fine cloth. He granted the Trojans 12 days of peace to conduct funeral rites for their champion, a brief respite in a war that had already consumed nearly a decade and the lives of countless heroes. As Hector's funeral pyre burned within the walls of Troy, Achilles stood on the shore, looking out at the dark sea. His wrath had been quenched in blood and tears, but the price had been immeasurable, and the prophecy remained unfulfilled. His own death approached, as certain as the dawn that would follow this temporary peace. The 12 days of peace granted for Hector's funeral rites passed like a brief dream in the long nightmare of war. When the truce ended, the conflict resumed with renewed intensity. Though Troy had lost its greatest defender, the city still stood defiant behind its god-built walls. The Greeks, despite the return of Achilles to their ranks, had suffered too many losses to attempt a direct assault on those legendary fortifications. Achilles, knowing his own death was approaching, fought with a strange combination of fury and fatalism. Each morning, he would arm himself in his divine armor. Each day he would cut down scores of Trojan warriors, and each night he would return to his tent, having survived another day, despite the prophecy hanging over him. The tide of battle had turned decisively in the Greeks' favor, yet final victory remained elusive. In this deadlock, fresh heroes arrived to bolster Troy's defense. From the east came Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, leading a contingent of women warriors as skilled and brave as any men. The Amazon queen sought glory and redemption, having accidentally killed her sister during a hunt. For a time, Penthesilea and her Amazons brought new hope to Troy. They led several successful sorties against the Greek lines, with the queen herself displaying extraordinary prowess in battle. Achilles, who had been withdrawing from combat after each day's necessary bloodshed, found himself drawn back to the front lines by tales of this warrior woman's skill. Their eventual confrontation was as brief as it was legendary. Penthesilea fought with remarkable courage, even managing to pierce Achilles' divine armor with her spear, one of the few to ever wound the seemingly invulnerable hero. But in the end, Achilles' godlike strength prevailed. As his spear found her heart, their eyes met, and according to some accounts, Achilles fell in love with the Amazon queen in the very moment he killed her. As he removed her helmet, revealing her face in death, some Greeks mockingly suggested that Achilles should take her body to his tent, implying a desecration worse than what he had done to Hector. Enraged by this disrespect toward a worthy opponent, Achilles killed the man who had spoken, Thersites, a common soldier known for his insolence. This act divided the Greek camp, with some feeling Achilles had overstepped by killing a fellow Greek over a fallen enemy. After the Amazons came another unexpected ally for Troy, Memnon, king of Ethiopia, son of the dawn goddess Eos. His arrival with a substantial force once again shifted the momentum of battle. Memnon's prowess was second only to Achilles, and he cut down many Greek heroes, including Nestor's son, Antilochus, who sacrificed himself to save his elderly father from Memnon's spear. Grief-stricken over the death of Antilochus, who had been dear to him since the loss of Patroclus, Achilles sought out Memnon for a duel that the gods themselves watched with special interest. On Olympus, Zeus weighed the fates of the two heroes on golden scales, and Memnon's scale sank, foretelling his doom. The duel between Achilles and Memnon was long and evenly matched. Both were sons of immortal mothers. Both wore divine armor. Both fought with superhuman skill. Spears were cast and dodged. Swords clashed and shields buckled, until at last Achilles drove his blade beneath Memnon's breastplate. As the Ethiopian king fell, his mother Eos wept tears that became the morning dew, and she continues to mourn him each dawn to this day. With each victory, Achilles drew closer to his prophesied doom. Even as the Trojans retreated toward their gates following Memnon's defeat, Paris, who had started the war but rarely distinguished himself in battle, stood with Apollo at the Scaean gate. As Achilles pursued the fleeing Trojans, Paris nocked an arrow to his bow. Apollo guided the shot to the one vulnerable spot on Achilles' body, his heel, which had not been dipped in the river Styx when his mother had sought to make him immortal as an infant. The arrow struck true, piercing the tendon that would forever after bear Achilles' name. The great hero stumbled, then fell, unable to believe that his end had come not at the hands of a worthy opponent in fair combat, but from a distance, shot by the man whose actions had launched the war. As Achilles lay dying, Paris and the Trojans moved to take his body, but Ajax and Odysseus fought their way to their fallen comrade, driving back the enemy and recovering the corpse of their greatest warrior. The death of Achilles plunged the Greek camp into mourning, more profound even than when Patroclus had fallen. For 17 days, the funeral games held in his honor paused the fighting as heroes competed to honor his memory. His divine armor became the subject of a bitter dispute between Ajax and Odysseus, both of whom had risked their lives to recover his body. When the Greek leaders awarded the armor to Odysseus in recognition of his cunning and strategic mind, Ajax, the physically strongest Greek after Achilles, was driven mad by the slight to his honor. In his madness, he slaughtered a flock of sheep, believing them to be his fellow Greeks who had wronged him. When he came to his senses and realized what he had done, his shame drove him to fall upon his own sword. Thus, within a short span, the Greeks had lost their three greatest warriors, Patroclus, Achilles, and Ajax. Victory seemed more distant than ever, especially when Apollo's priest Calchas revealed that Troy would never fall while it possessed the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena that protected the city. Odysseus and Diomedes undertook a dangerous night mission, infiltrating Troy through underground passages, stealing the Palladium and escaping back to the Greek camp. Still, the walls stood unbreached. 10 years of siege, countless heroes dead on both sides, and the end seemed no closer than when the 1,000 ships had first landed on Trojan shores. It was then that Odysseus, whose strategic mind had been sharpened by a decade of inconclusive warfare, conceived a plan so audacious that it would either bring about Troy's downfall or result in the final destruction of the Greek forces. "We cannot defeat Troy through strength of arms," he told the assembled Greek leaders in Agamemnon's tent. "Their walls are impregnable, built by the gods themselves. But what if we could convince the Trojans to bring us inside those walls of their own accord?" The plan that Odysseus outlined that night, the stratagem of the wooden horse, would become the most famous military deception in history, a testament to the adage that when strength fails, cunning may yet prevail. Meanwhile, within Troy's walls, the mood was cautiously optimistic. The death of Achilles had raised hopes that the siege might soon be lifted. Paris, elevated in status by his fortunate shot, strutted through the palace as if the war were already won, but his triumph was short-lived. In a skirmish outside the walls, Paris himself was wounded by a poisoned arrow shot by Philoctetes, who had finally been brought from Lemnos to the Greek camp after a prophecy revealed that Troy could not fall without Heracles' bow, which Philoctetes possessed. The wound festered, and Paris, in desperation, sought out his first wife, the mountain nymph Oenone, whom he had abandoned for Helen years before. Only she had the power to heal such wounds, but bitter over his betrayal, she refused to help. By the time she relented and rushed to Troy, Paris was already dead. In her grief, Oenone threw herself upon his funeral pyre. Helen, who had been Paris's prize and the cause of so much suffering, was passed to his brother Deiphobus, though some in Troy suggested returning her to the Greeks to end the conflict. But after 10 years of war and incalculable losses on both sides, neither the Greeks nor the Trojans were willing to end matters so simply. Too much blood had been spilled, too many heroes had fallen, too many oaths of vengeance had been sworn. The stage was set for the final act of the tragedy, a desperate gamble by the Greeks, a fatal mistake by the Trojans, and the fiery end of a city that had stood for centuries. The wooden horse stood on the plains before Troy, massive and imposing in the golden light of sunset. Its polished flanks gleamed, and its carved head seemed to gaze toward the city with hollow eyes. The Trojan scouts who first spotted it approached cautiously, puzzled by this strange object left behind on the otherwise abandoned beach. The Greek camps that had dotted the shoreline for a decade were gone. Tents struck, cooking fires extinguished, waste pits filled in. More shocking still, the vast fleet that had brought the invaders to Trojan shores had vanished. Only blackened patches on the sand remained where the 1,000 ships had been dragged up for so many years. Word spread quickly through Troy. Citizens rushed to the walls, hardly daring to believe that their long nightmare might be over. The Greeks had finally abandoned their futile siege. After 10 grinding years, the war might truly be at an end. But what was this massive wooden structure they had left behind? A scouting party ventured out from the city gates, the first time in years that Trojans had been able to walk the plain without fear of Greek arrows or spears. They found the beach deserted except for a single Greek soldier bound to a post. The man was bruised and bloodied, apparently left behind in the Greeks' hasty departure. This man was Sinon, chosen by Odysseus for his quick wit and convincing manner. When the Trojans cut him free, he fell to his knees in apparent gratitude. "Thank the gods you found me," he gasped. "They would have sacrificed me for favorable winds had I not escaped my bonds." The Trojans, suspicious but curious, questioned him about the wooden horse. Sinon's tale was a masterpiece of deception, crafted to play on Trojan pride and religious fears. "The horse is an offering to Athena," he explained, "built at Chalcus, the prophet's instruction. The Greeks made it so large that you could not bring it through your gates, ensuring it would remain outside your walls. For there is a prophecy. If the Trojans take possession of this offering to Athena, they will one day invade Greece and destroy our cities as you almost destroyed Troy. But if you damage the horse, Athena's wrath will fall upon Troy." The Trojans debated what to do with this strange gift as they escorted Sinon back to the city. Some, like Thymoetes, urged bringing the horse inside as a trophy of their victory. Others, more suspicious, suggested burning it or at least examining it more carefully. Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, voiced the strongest objections. Rushing down from the citadel, he cried, "Have you lost your minds? Do you really believe the Greeks have given up and sailed away? This is surely a trick. Either there are armed men inside this thing, or it's a machine to overtop our walls, or some other deception. Whatever it is, do not trust it." To emphasize his point, Laocoon hurled his spear at the horse's flank. The hollow thud that echoed back should have confirmed his suspicions, but at that very moment, the gods intervened to seal Troy's fate. As Laocoon returned to the shore to sacrifice a bull to Poseidon, two enormous serpents emerged from the sea. With horrifying speed, they wrapped themselves around the priest and his two young sons who had joined him for the ritual. Before the eyes of the terrified Trojans, the serpents crushed the three to death, their screams cutting off as their ribs cracked in the powerful coils. Having completed their grim work, the serpents slithered away to the temple of Apollo on the citadel. The stunned Trojans interpreted this as divine punishment for Laocoon's assault on the horse. They murmured, "The priest was struck down for his impiety. The horse must truly be sacred to Athena." Then came a second sign. Helen's sister-in-law, Cassandra, blessed with prophetic sight by Apollo but cursed never to be believed, ran through the streets screaming that the horse would bring destruction if brought within the walls. "Fire," she cried. "I see fire and blood. Do not bring death into our city." But as always, her true prophecies were dismissed as madness. With these apparent divine judgments influencing their decision, the Trojans made their fateful choice. The massive horse would be brought into the city as a trophy, an offering to Athena. But the city gates were too small to admit the structure. In their eagerness, the Trojans did what 10 years of Greek siege had failed to accomplish. They breached their own walls, tearing down a section to create an opening large enough for the horse. Young men attached ropes to the wooden colossus and began the laborious process of dragging it from the beach into the city. Wheels had been attached to its base to facilitate this movement, yet still it was slow, arduous work. Crowds lined the route, singing hymns to Athena and celebrating what they believed was their deliverance from war. As the horse passed through the broken wall into Troy proper, maidens scattered flowers before it, and priests offered prayers to Athena, seeking her blessing now that her gift had been properly honored. With tremendous effort, the Trojans pulled the horse into the central plaza before the main temple, where it would stand as a monument to their survival and victory. That night, Troy erupted in the first true celebration it had known in a decade. Wine flowed freely, music filled the streets, and even the guards drank their fill. The exhausted population, released at last from the constant threat of Greek attack, abandoned themselves to revelry. As the night deepened, the sounds of celebration gradually faded, replaced by the heavy breathing of drunk, exhausted sleepers. Inside the wooden horse, the chosen Greek warriors had endured a day of cramped discomfort, barely daring to breathe as the Trojans examined their hiding place. Besides Odysseus, the hollow belly concealed Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, Ajax the Lesser, and other notable fighters, the best of those who had survived the decade-long conflict. When the city finally fell silent, Sinon crept to the horse and gave the signal. From inside, Odysseus cautiously opened the hidden trapdoor in the horse's belly, and one by one, the warriors descended on ropes to the street below. They moved with practiced silence, years of warfare having taught them the art of stealth. Their first targets were the guards at the main gates, who were quickly dispatched. As those gates swung open, Sinon lit a massive signal fire on the walls, a beacon visible far out to sea, where the Greek fleet had been hiding behind a nearby island. With surprising speed, the ships that had seemed to abandon the siege returned, laden with soldiers eager for the final assault. Throughout the sleeping city, the Greeks who had hidden in the horse began their deadly work. Some, led by Neoptolemus, moved toward the royal palace. Others targeted the barracks where what remained of Troy's fighting force lay in drunken slumber. Odysseus and Menelaus made for the house of Deiphobus, where they expected to find Helen. By the time the first Trojan citizens awoke to the sounds of combat, Greek soldiers were already pouring through the open gates and spreading throughout the city. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Trojans, caught completely by surprise and still half drunk from their celebration, had no chance to organize an effective defense. The Greeks, hardened by 10 years of war and remembering their many fallen comrades, showed little mercy. Houses were set ablaze, initially to provide light for their attack, but soon as a deliberate tactic to drive out hiding Trojans and create chaos. The flames spread quickly from building to building, aided by a strong wind that seemed to be sent by the gods themselves, perhaps Hera and Athena, completing their vengeance against the city they had hated since Paris's judgment. King Priam, awakened by the sounds of slaughter, donned his armor for the first time in years. Though far too old to fight effectively, he was determined to die as a king. His wife Hecuba begged him to seek sanctuary at Zeus's altar, but he replied, "I have lived too long already to see my city burn and my sons die before me." His end came not in honorable combat, but in sacrilege. Neoptolemus, proving himself more savage even than his father Achilles, pursued the aged king to the very altar of Zeus. There, as Priam clutched the sacred symbols of the god, the young warrior cut him down without hesitation or respect for the holy place, an act of impiety for which the gods would later demand payment. Throughout the burning city, similar scenes of brutality unfolded. Ajax the Lesser found Cassandra clinging to the statue of Athena, seeking sanctuary in the goddess's temple. Unmoved by the sacred location or the young woman's desperate pleas, he violated her beneath the very eyes of Athena's statue. The goddess, outraged by this desecration, marked Ajax for destruction. In the house of Deiphobus, Paris's brother, who had married Helen after Paris's death, Menelaus finally confronted the woman who had been the cause, or at least the catalyst, of the entire war. Some stories say Helen had already betrayed her Trojan husband, signaling to the Greeks with lamps placed in the windows. Others suggest she was as surprised as any Trojan by the night attack. Menelaus burst into their bedchamber with his sword raised, intending to kill both his wife and her new husband. Deiphobus died quickly, but when Menelaus finally stood face to face with Helen, something unexpected happened. Whether it was her legendary beauty, her skillful pleading, or some remnant of the love he had once felt for her, Menelaus found he could not strike the fatal blow. Instead, he dragged her roughly toward the ships, declaring she would face judgment back in Sparta. As dawn broke over Troy, the destruction was nearly complete. The royal palace, which had stood for centuries, was consumed by flames. The temples were looted of their treasures. The streets were filled with the bodies of the dead and the cries of the dying. Those Trojans who had survived, primarily women, children, and the elderly, were being herded toward the beach like cattle, destined for slavery in distant Greek lands. Among these captives was Andromache, widow of Hector. Her grief, already immeasurable from her husband's death, was compounded by unimaginable horror as she watched Greek soldiers take her young son, Astyanax, Hector's only child, and throw him from the high walls of the city. The Greeks had decreed that no male of Priam's royal line could be allowed to live, lest he grow up to seek vengeance for Troy. Hecuba, who had been queen of the wealthiest city in Asia, was reduced to a wailing captive, her white hair matted with the ashes of her burning kingdom. She had lived to see almost all of her many children die, Paris, Hector, and so many others fallen in battle, and now her daughters dragged away to slavery. In her overwhelming grief, Some accounts say she was transformed into a howling dog, forever giving voice to her anguish. The fall of Troy was completed as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The Greeks gathered their plunder and captives on the shore, preparing to load them onto the waiting ships. The city continued to burn behind them, black smoke rising in a column visible for miles, a funeral pyre for a civilization. Before departing, the Greeks performed funeral rites for their fallen and made offerings to the gods, some in gratitude, some in appeasement, for the many impieties committed during the sack of the city. Agamemnon claimed Cassandra as his prize, a fateful choice that would eventually lead to his own violent end. Ajax the Lesser, having offended Athena with his treatment of Cassandra, refused to make proper sacrifices, boasting that he had triumphed despite the god's will, another act of hubris that would seal his doom. After 10 long years, the Trojan War was over. The Greeks had achieved their stated goal. Helen was recovered, Troy was punished, but at a terrible cost. Thousands of their countrymen lay buried in foreign soil. Those who survived were changed, hardened by war, and haunted by the atrocities they had committed. And for many, the true hardships were just beginning. As the Greek fleet finally departed from the smoking ruins of Troy, they could not know what awaited them. The voyage home would prove as deadly as the war itself for many. Storms sent by offended gods would scatter the fleet. Some ships would sink beneath the waves. Others would be blown far off course. Of the heroes who had set out for Troy a decade earlier, some would wander for years before seeing their homelands again. Others would return only to find treachery awaiting them. Very few would enjoy peaceful ends to their days. The destruction of Troy marked the end of an age, the twilight of heroes, the closing chapter of a more mythic time when gods walked among men and mighty warriors performed deeds worthy of song. The bards would keep these tales alive for centuries, ensuring that names like Hector and Achilles, Odysseus and Agamemnon would never be forgotten. And what of Troy itself? The city that had stood proud for centuries was reduced to smouldering ruins, its wealth plundered, its people enslaved or slaughtered. Yet even in destruction, it achieved a kind of immortality. Though its walls were leveled and its towers toppled, Troy would live forever in the words of poets, a cautionary tale of pride and folly, of divine caprice and human suffering, of how a single act, Paris's seizure of Helen, could unleash consequences beyond imagining. In time, the ruins were buried under layers of earth. New settlements were built atop the old. The physical Troy disappeared, leading some to question whether it had ever truly existed. Was it merely a poet's invention, a metaphor, a legend? For nearly 3,000 years, the location of Troy remained a mystery. Then, in the late 19th century, an amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, guided by clues in Homer's text, began excavations at a site in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik. There he uncovered the remains of not one city, but 9, built one atop another through the centuries. One of these layers, now referred to as Troy 7, showed signs of violent destruction, dating to approximately 1250 BCE, roughly the time when the Trojan War is thought to have occurred. Whether this proves the historical reality of Achilles and Hector, of Helen and Paris, remains debatable. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between myth and history, a real conflict expanded and embellished through centuries of oral tradition before Homer captured it in verse. What is certain is that the story of Troy continues to captivate us, to speak to something essential about the human experience, the terrible cost of pride, the futility of war, the power of love and hatred to shape destinies. The walls of Troy have crumbled to dust. The heroes have long since departed for the Elysian fields, and even the gods of Olympus have faded into memory. Yet the echoes of that ancient conflict still resonate, reminding us that in our glories and our failings, in our capacity for both valor and savagery, we remain connected to those distant ancestors who fought and died beneath the walls of sacred Ilium.